3 months after a billionaire divorced his pregnant wife to protect his empire. He was sitting in federal custody asking her for one last meeting. Outside the courthouse, the woman who once celebrated the divorce was fighting back tears as reporters surrounded her. So what changed? How did a woman he tried to erase become the one person who could destroy him? The divorce was finalized
These
in less
projections
than
confirm
21
our market
days.
dominance.
In
Growth is
Manhattan,
accelerating
that kind
as
of
planned.
speed did not signal heartbreak. It signaled strategy. Madeline Pierce stood outside the private arbitration office with one hand resting on her 7-month pregnant stomach, watching reporters gather across the street. They had been tipped off, of course. Grant Holloway never left optics to chance. By sunset, the headlines were already circulating: billionaire tech investor finalizes amicable split ahead of IPO expansion. Amicable. The word almost made her laugh. Grant exited the building minutes later, perfectly composed, navy suit tailored to precision. He paused briefly for cameras, offering a controlled statement. Madeline and I have chosen different paths. My priority remains stability and growth for everyone involved. Stability. Growth. The language of business, not marriage. Madeline said nothing. Her silence unsettled him more than outrage would have. Inside the settlement packet she carried was a generous financial agreement, structured trusts, property divisions, and one critical element, an aggressive non-disclosure agreement. Every clause was airtight. No interviews. No statements. No discussion of internal company matters past or present. Grant had not just divorced her. He had neutralized her. Vanessa Cole waited inside Grant's black sedan parked discreetly near the curb. She wore white, deliberately symbolic, and her smile as Grant entered the car was small but victorious. "Clean," she said softly. Grant adjusted his cufflinks. Contained. Madeline watched the car disappear into traffic. She felt no dramatic collapse, no cinematic breakdown. Just something colder. Something sharper. Because the timing made no sense. 2 weeks earlier, she had questioned Grant about unusual asset transfers routed through shell entities she didn't recognize. As a former partner in the company's early development phase, she still understood financial structures well enough to recognize patterns. He had brushed it off with a practiced smile. "You're reading too much into restructuring," he had said. Now, with the IPO scheduled in less than 2 weeks, the divorce was finalized, and her access to internal dashboards had been revoked overnight. That wasn't coincidence. It was sequencing. Back at her temporary apartment, Madeline opened her laptop and attempted to log into the shared archival system she had once helped build. Access denied. Her credentials had been wiped within hours of the divorce filing. Her phone buzzed with a message from a mutual acquaintance: Vanessa hosting private dinner tonight. Celebrating new chapter. New chapter. Madeline placed the phone face down and exhaled slowly. The baby shifted inside her, as if reacting to the tension she tried to suppress. The doctor had warned her about stress. But stress felt secondary to clarity. She replayed the last 3 months in her mind. Grant's sudden insistence on separate counsel. The speed of arbitration. The way he had avoided direct eye contact whenever she asked about offshore subsidiaries. And the clause in the settlement that prevented her from discussing any operational or financial observations made prior to dissolution. Observations. Not accusations. Not claims. Observations. Grant wasn't just protecting his image. He was isolating risk. Across town, Vanessa raised a champagne glass inside Grant's penthouse, surrounded by carefully curated guests. "To fresh beginnings," she said lightly. "And simplified lives." Grant forced a smile, but his mind was elsewhere. He had anticipated resistance, emotion, maybe public pushback. What he hadn't anticipated was Madeline's composure. She had signed without argument. That unsettled him. Later that evening, Madeline sat alone in the dim light of her apartment, scrolling through archived emails she had privately backed up months ago. One exchange caught her attention, a compliance review note flagged for post-merger adjustment. It referenced valuation escalations in properties tied to shell corporations. The timestamp was recent. After she had asked questions. Her phone vibrated suddenly. Unknown sender. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Then she opened the message. Attached was a secure file link and a single sentence. Your name is tied to something you didn't authorize. Her pulse slowed instead of racing. Because deep down, she already knew. The divorce had never been about love. It had been about timing. Madeline did not click the secure link immediately. She stared at the message for a full minute, studying the sentence again. Your name is tied to something you didn't authorize. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't threatening. It was precise. That made it dangerous. She copied the link into a protected browser session, routing through a secure VPN she had once used during early investor negotiations. The file required a secondary access code. Seconds later, another message arrived. Check your email from May 14th. Subject line, Compliance Review. Her pulse remained steady as she searched the archive. There it was. A routine compliance email she had skimmed months ago. Embedded within it was a string of alphanumeric characters. The access key. The encrypted file opened. Spreadsheets unfolded across her screen, property valuations, acquisition schedules, offshore routing diagrams. She recognized the formatting instantly. It was internal executive-level documentation. And then she saw it. Authorization log, Madeline Pierce, spousal clearance, approved. Her breath caught. The approval timestamp was 3 weeks ago. The day she had been at her prenatal appointment. She had never authorized anything. Her phone rang before panic could settle in. Madeline? The male voice was cautious, controlled. This is Ethan Caldwell. She recognized the name immediately. Former compliance officer. Quiet. Methodical. Disappeared from internal directories 2 months earlier. You sent the file, she said evenly. Yes. Why? Because I refused to sign off on the final audit adjustments, Ethan replied. And because your name shouldn't be carrying what his is. She closed her eyes briefly. Explain it clearly. Ethan did not hesitate. Grant inflated pre-IPO asset valuations across 3 subsidiary entities. The increases were rerouted through offshore holding companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. On paper, it looks like strategic diversification. In reality, it's engineered overvaluation. And my authorization? Embedded into the liability buffer, Ethan said. Spousal access privileges allowed him to distribute approval thresholds. If regulators trace the chain after IPO closes, the structure implicates you as co-authorizer. The precision of it made her almost admire the architecture. So the divorce, she said slowly, was risk containment. Yes, Ethan replied. Once the separation finalized, your shared liability window narrowed. Public narrative shifts to unstable ex-wife if scrutiny begins. Madeline walked to the window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Does Vanessa know? No, Ethan said bluntly. She thinks this is about optics and lifestyle. She doesn't have clearance. That tracked. Grant never trusted emotion with infrastructure. He believes I won't act, Madeline said quietly. He believes you don't have proof, Ethan corrected. And you? I kept copies. Silence settled between them, not heavy but strategic. Ethan continued. If the IPO completes, valuation locks into post-offering structure. Regulatory intervention becomes exponentially harder. Investors complicate jurisdiction. Everything gets layered. How long? She asked. 10 days. The number landed like a clock starting in her chest. Why are you doing this? She pressed. Ethan exhaled slowly. Because when I refused to certify the numbers, he removed me. And because I won't let him weaponize you. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach. Send everything you have, she said. I already have, he replied. Check the second folder. It includes biometric authorization logs tied directly to his executive key. She opened it. Grant Holloway, executive override, confirmed. There it was. Direct digital authentication. Not delegated. Not ambiguous. His. If you go forward, Ethan warned, he escalates. He already escalated, she said calmly. He divorced me to protect himself. Ethan paused. He thinks you'll stay quiet to protect the settlement. Madeline's voice hardened slightly. He forgets I helped build the foundation he's standing on. Across town, Grant stood in a boardroom reviewing final IPO launch projections. Investors dialed in from London and Singapore. The numbers looked clean. Controlled. Predictable. Vanessa texted him mid-meeting. Dinner tonight? Celebrate early? Grant glanced at the message and didn't respond. Something unsettled him, though he couldn't name it. Back in her apartment, Madeline closed the encrypted file and leaned back slowly. 10 days. 10 days before everything locked into permanence. Her divorce had not been emotional. It had been strategic removal. She looked at the calendar on her wall and circled the IPO date in red. 10 days until the door closed. Or broke open. Madeline noticed the car on the third night. It was subtle at first. A black sedan parked across from her building, engine idling longer than necessary. The same silhouette behind tinted glass. It appeared again the following morning as she left for a prenatal checkup. And again that evening when she returned from meeting Ethan Caldwell in a quiet midtown office. Grant Holloway did not believe in loose ends. Inside his private conference room overlooking the Hudson, Grant spoke calmly to a contracted investigative firm. No confrontation, he instructed. Observation only. I want to know who she meets, what she accesses, and who approaches her. Understood, the lead investigator replied. Grant ended the call and stared at the Manhattan skyline. He had built empires through anticipation. Risk management was instinct. Madeline's silence unsettled him more than accusation would have. She had 10 days of access before the IPO sealed permanently. 10 days of potential disruption. Across media platforms, subtle articles began circulating. Sources close to Holloway confirmed divorce strain took emotional toll. Insiders suggest Madeline struggled with stress during pregnancy. No direct accusations. Just concern layered into narrative. Vanessa Cole amplified it without appearing cruel. During a charity gala interview, she offered a sympathetic smile. Divorce is difficult for anyone, she said softly. Some people handle pressure differently. The implications spread quickly. Madeline read the headlines from her apartment, her expression unreadable. She understood the tactic immediately. If she moved publicly, she would be framed as unstable retaliation. If she remained silent, Grant controlled the storyline. Her phone buzzed with a notification, custody petition filed. Grant had escalated. The document cited emotional volatility and potential stress-induced instability, requesting preliminary review of prenatal custody considerations. It was carefully worded, legally restrained, but strategically aggressive. He wasn't just protecting the IPO. He was building a narrative shield. Madeline scheduled an immediate meeting with Clara Whitmore. Clara's office was understated but commanding. former federal securities prosecutor known for dismantling corporate fraud cases with surgical precision. She reviewed Ethan's archive without interruption, her sharp eyes scanning biometric logs and valuation tables. "This is deliberate inflation," Clara said finally. "Structured to survive surface audits." "And my authorization?" Madeline asked. "Embedded as distributed liability," Clara replied. "If regulators trace post-IPO, you appear complicit." Madeline exhaled slowly. "He divorced me to isolate exposure." "Yes," Clara confirmed. "And the custody petition strengthens his narrative positioning." Madeline's jaw tightened slightly. "Can we stop it?" Clara leaned back. "If we file an emergency sealed complaint with the SEC before the IPO closes, we can trigger regulatory review. That freezes the offering. And if we wait? After the IPO, unwinding becomes exponentially harder. Investors complicate jurisdiction. It becomes political." Silence stretched between them. Outside Clara's office window, Manhattan moved with indifference. Grant believed control equaled certainty. But certainty required silence. Madeline placed her hand over her stomach as the baby shifted gently. For a brief moment, fear surfaced, not for herself, but for what prolonged litigation could mean. "My child will not be used as collateral," she said quietly. Clara studied her. "Understand something clearly. Once we file, he escalates. Publicly. Legally. Personally." "He already has," Madeline replied. That evening, the black sedan returned. This time, Madeline stepped onto the sidewalk and looked directly at it. The driver didn't move. The message was clear. "We're watching." Her phone rang moments later. Grant's name illuminated the screen. She answered. "You're moving recklessly," he said, voice calm but edged. "You filed for custody," she replied evenly. "I filed for protection," he corrected. "You're under emotional strain." "You're under investigation," she said quietly. Silence lingered. "You don't have proof," Grant said. Madeline glanced at the city skyline. "You're assuming." "You think regulators will protect you?" he pressed. "This could drag for years." "I'm not afraid of time," she replied. "You are." He ended the call without another word. Back inside Clara's office, final drafts of the sealed submission were prepared. Transaction trails attached. Biometric confirmations logged. Custody petition documentation cross-referenced for retaliatory context. Clara closed the file and looked at Madeline directly. "We can freeze the IPO," she said calmly. "But once we do, this becomes war." Madeline didn't hesitate. "Then let him fight on record." Grant Holloway did not panic. He recalibrated. The morning after Clara Whitmore finalized the sealed complaint draft, financial blogs began circulating anonymous commentary. Sources close to the Holloway divorce describe emotional volatility during pregnancy. Insiders suggest Madeline struggled with stress long before separation. No direct allegations. No verifiable claims. Just narrative shaping. Grant watched the traction analytics from his private office, noting engagement spikes. Reputation management firms worked quietly in the background, amplifying concern-driven language rather than accusation. Concern was more powerful. It sounded humane. In a televised business segment that afternoon, Grant appeared composed and measured. "Divorce is painful for any family," he said carefully. "My only priority is ensuring a stable future for my child." Stable. The word was intentional. Across town, Vanessa Cole reinforced the undertone during a lifestyle interview. She smiled sympathetically when asked about the divorce. "Madeline has always been sensitive," she said lightly. "Some people just don't handle high-pressure environments well." The comment trended within hours. Social media amplified it into cruelty. Comment threads filled with armchair diagnoses and moral judgment. Strangers debated Madeline's stability as if it were public property. The pregnancy became a discussion point. The custody petition became proof in the court of public opinion. Madeline read it all in silence. The black sedan still appeared each evening, but she had stopped looking at it. Surveillance was expected. What she hadn't expected was how efficiently Grant weaponized perception. Her phone vibrated with notifications. Old acquaintances asking careful questions. Distant investors subtly distancing themselves. Sympathy messages that carried suspicion beneath the surface. Grant was isolating her socially before she could speak legally. In Clara's office, the atmosphere was clinical and focused. "He's shaping a preemptive credibility attack," Clara said. "If we submit now, the narrative becomes unstable. Ex-wife retaliates." "And if we wait?" Madeline asked. "He strengthens it." Madeline exhaled slowly. "So timing becomes everything." Clara nodded once. 7 days until IPO closes. After that, regulatory disruption becomes harder. 7 days. Madeline returned home and set up her laptop camera deliberately. She recorded a video in one take. "My name is Madeline Pierce. I am 7 months pregnant. I am not unstable. I am not vindictive. I am asking for transparency regarding financial activities I did not authorize." Her voice remained calm, measured, almost detached. There is a difference between emotional and inconvenient. She stopped recording and saved the file without uploading it. Not yet. Across the river, Grant met privately with 2 board members expressing concern. "Regulatory rumor is circulating," one said cautiously. "We need reassurance." "There is no formal complaint," Grant replied evenly. "Not yet." But doubt had entered the room. Later that evening, Vanessa confronted him in the penthouse. "Why is this not ending?" she demanded. The narrative should have crushed her by now. Grant stared out the window. "She hasn't reacted." "She's pregnant," Vanessa said sharply. "What could she possibly do?" Grant's silence lingered too long. Back in Clara's office, final attachments were compiled. Transaction spreadsheets. Offshore registration documents. Biometric authorization logs. Custody petition filing timestamps cross-referenced to valuation inflation. Clara looked at Madeline directly. "If we submit the sealed complaint to the SEC, it will freeze the IPO pending review. But understand, this becomes federal." Madeline did not hesitate. "Submit it." Clara pressed send. The confirmation receipt did not arrive immediately. That night, headlines intensified. Friends expressed concern for Holloway's unborn child. Custody petition highlights emotional instability. Grant believed momentum was on his side. At 8:17 the following morning, Clara's phone buzzed. She read the message once, then looked up at Madeline. "They've acknowledged receipt," Clara said quietly. The SEC had officially logged the complaint. 48 hours before the IPO launch, the call came. Grant Holloway was standing in front of a wall-sized screen displaying projected opening valuations when his general counsel's face appeared on the secure line, pale and unusually direct. "We've received formal notice," the attorney said. "The SEC has initiated an emergency review. The offering is temporarily suspended pending regulatory clarification." For a moment, the room felt suspended in vacuum. "Temporarily?" Grant repeated, his voice calm but thinning. "Yes. Effective immediately." Silence spread across the executive floor within minutes. Analysts stopped mid-conversation. Assistants lowered their voices. The carefully choreographed countdown to market debut stalled in a single sentence. The stock, already trading in private pre-offer positions, trembled. Financial news tickers adjusted language from anticipated launch to regulatory pause. Investors began calling. Grant ended the line and stood motionless. She wouldn't risk this, he said quietly to himself. But Madeline had. Across Manhattan, Clara Whitmore closed her laptop after confirming the freeze order. She looked at Madeline steadily. "It's official," Clara said. "They're reviewing the valuation structure before allowing the IPO to proceed." Madeline exhaled slowly. Not relief. Not celebration. Just confirmation. "He underestimated timing," she said. In elite social circles, Vanessa Cole felt the shift immediately. Invitations to private preview events were withdrawn. A luxury brand quietly postponed an endorsement discussion. The whispers had changed tone. Concern had turned to distance. She stormed into Grant's penthouse that evening, heels striking marble with sharp precision. "They're pulling away," she said. "What did she do?" Grant poured himself a drink without answering. "She froze the IPO," Vanessa pressed. "How?" "Through regulatory channels," he replied flatly. Vanessa's composure cracked slightly. "I thought you handled it." "I did," he said, but the words lacked their former certainty. That night, Grant requested a private meeting. Clara advised caution, but Madeline agreed. The meeting took place in a neutral office downtown, security present but distant. Grant entered first, controlled as ever, but the edge beneath his composure was visible now. "You crossed a line," he said without greeting. "I followed one," Madeline replied calmly. He leaned forward slightly. "You've destabilized investors. Thousands of employees are now uncertain." "You destabilized them," she corrected. "I exposed it." His jaw tightened. "Name your price." The offer came smoothly, rehearsed. "I will restore full financial access. Increase your settlement tenfold. Establish irrevocable trusts for the child. Withdraw the complaint." Madeline held his gaze steadily. "Truth doesn't negotiate." "You're emotional," he said. "No," she replied softly. "I'm precise." Grant stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If this collapses completely, you don't just hurt me. You damage market confidence. You damage future growth." "You structured that risk," she answered. "Not me." For the first time, something resembling frustration overtook his restraint. "You think regulators will save you?" "I think documentation will." Silence lingered heavily between them. He studied her for signs of doubt and found none. Across financial networks, narrative language shifted rapidly. Headlines read, "SEC review raises questions around Holloway valuations." Analysts debated potential internal whistleblowers. Madeline's name surfaced not as unstable ex-wife, but as possible source of compliance inquiry. Public sentiment began tilting. Vanessa watched the coverage in disbelief. The woman she had dismissed as emotionally fragile was now being framed as principled. "Say something," Vanessa demanded of Grant later that night. "There is nothing to say," he replied coldly. "Not publicly." Privately, board members began requesting emergency sessions. Legal advisors expanded contingency plans. What had once been a controlled launch now resembled a structural unraveling. Madeline returned home and sat quietly by the window, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. The baby shifted gently, unaware of stock fluctuations and boardroom tension. She felt no triumph. Only inevitability. Her phone buzzed. Clara's name appeared. "They've escalated beyond the freeze," Clara said. "How?" Madeline asked. "Federal investigators want sworn testimony," Clara replied. They're opening a formal inquiry. The war had just entered a new phase. The subpoenas arrived at 9:03 a.m. Not as rumors. Not as speculation. As federal directives. Grant Holloway was reviewing damage control projections when his chief legal officer entered the executive conference room without knocking. The interruption alone signaled escalation. "They've issued formal subpoenas," she said, placing a sealed envelope on the table. Full document production. Internal communications. Biometric authorization logs. Grant didn't react immediately. He opened the envelope with steady hands, scanning the language carefully. The scope was broad. Too broad for a surface audit. "They're building structure," he said quietly. Across the trading floor, employees sensed the shift. Conversations lowered. Assistants moved faster. 2 board members scheduled personal leave within hours. Financial analysts began revising risk outlooks. The empire no longer felt untouchable. Within federal review teams, forensic accountants traced offshore transfers directly to Grant's executive biometric key. The authentication timestamps aligned with inflated valuation adjustments. The architecture Ethan Caldwell had described was no longer theoretical. It was mapped. Vanessa Cole read the first major investigative headline while seated at a private brunch she had refused to cancel. Biometric logs tie Holloway to offshore routing. Her smile faded. By afternoon, she issued a carefully worded public statement: "I have never been involved in operational or financial decisions at Holloway Holdings. I support full transparency." Distance. Grant saw the statement within minutes. "So this is how loyalty functions," he muttered. For the first time, he considered the possibility of redirecting responsibility. Senior compliance officers. Delegated executives. Structural misinterpretation. If Blaine needed a vessel, he would construct one. But the biometric confirmations complicated deflection. Meanwhile, Madeline's body began absorbing the cost of prolonged conflict. Sharp abdominal tightening forced Clara to drive her to the hospital for monitoring. The doctors stabilized her condition and issued strict warnings about stress exposure. "You need rest," the physician insisted. Madeline managed a faint nod. Rest felt like a foreign concept. Clara remained beside her hospital bed reviewing updates on her tablet. "The custody motion has been preliminarily dismissed," she said quietly. The judge cited retaliatory timing. Madeline closed her eyes briefly. One front had weakened. "What about Ethan?" she asked. "Federal authorities have placed him under protective supervision," Clara replied. "He's cooperating fully." Protection meant escalation. Across the city, Grant received confirmation that 2 additional board members were stepping down. Investors were requesting emergency transparency briefings. His carefully built narrative of stability was fracturing under documented evidence. Late that evening, he reviewed internal damage reports alone in his office. Compliance logs revealed structured sequencing, valuation increase, offshore routing, spousal authorization embedding, divorce finalization. The design that once felt brilliant now resembled premeditation. His phone buzzed with a notification: federal request for encrypted executive storage access. He froze. There was one archive he had not anticipated surfacing. A contingency repository, private executive memos, scenario recordings, strategic frameworks. It had been designed as protection, not liability. In the hospital room, Clara received the same update. "There's an encrypted executive file," she said carefully. "Stored separately from operational systems." Madeline opened her eyes. "Content?" "Unknown," Clara replied. But investigators flagged it as potentially relevant. Madeline understood instinctively. Grant did not operate without backup strategies. Back in the penthouse, Vanessa confronted him again. You said this would settle, she demanded. Now they're talking about criminal exposure. Grant stared at her, something colder settling in his expression. You should reconsider public appearances. The implication was clear. Distance yourself while you can. Later that night, federal investigators delivered a formal request requiring biometric authorization to access the encrypted executive file. Court approval was already in motion. Grant read the order twice. The file required his direct thumbprint to unlock. If he complied, its contents would be exposed. If he refused, obstruction charges could follow. In her hospital bed, Madeline stared at the ceiling, feeling the baby move gently beneath her palm. The storm was no longer external. It was structural. Clara's phone vibrated again. She read the message silently before looking at Madeline. They've secured judicial approval, Clara said quietly. The encrypted file must be unlocked. Madeline's gaze sharpened. And it can only be accessed, Clara continued, with Grant's biometric authorization. The final layer of his own system was about to be opened. The courtroom felt unusually still the morning the biometric order was enforced. Grant Holloway stood at the defense table beside his attorneys, expression controlled but thinner than before. Across the room, federal investigators prepared a secured terminal link to the encrypted executive archive. The judge's ruling had been clear: refusal to unlock would constitute obstruction. Mr. Holloway, the federal prosecutor said evenly, place your thumb on the scanner. For a fraction of a second, Grant hesitated. In that pause lived calculation, pride, and the awareness that whatever waited inside that archive could not be recontained. Then he pressed his thumb down. The encryption dissolved. Files populated the federal monitor in neat, time-stamped order: valuation drafts, internal memos, contingency planning outlines. One folder was flagged prominently: Executive Risk Strategy, Private. An investigator opened the audio file within it. Grant's voice filled the courtroom speakers. If regulatory scrutiny escalates pre-offering, narrative shift must occur immediately. Spousal authorization structure provides distributed liability. Public framing should emphasize emotional instability and prenatal stress vulnerability. Custody petition accelerates leverage and discredits opposition. The room went silent. There was no ambiguity. No interpretation gap. It was not strategy in theory, it was confession in practice. Madeline sat beside Clara Whitmore, her hand resting lightly over her stomach. She did not flinch. She did not smile. The vindication was not loud. It was absolute. Grant's attorney leaned toward him urgently. We can argue context. Grant did not respond. By noon, the audio recording had reached national newsrooms. Leaked recording reveals Holloway plan to frame ex-wife. SEC investigation deepens after damning audio emerges. The IPO, already paused, was permanently terminated by the board within hours. Investor confidence collapsed completely. Partner firms issued immediate distancing statements. Financial analysts shifted language from scrutiny to criminal exposure. Vanessa Cole watched the live coverage from a private suite she had insisted on maintaining. When the audio clip replayed, Grant's voice coldly mapping out Madeline's discrediting, her composure finally fractured. He wasn't supposed to say it, she whispered. But he had. Cameras captured her pale expression as reporters surrounded the courthouse entrance. Questions came fast. Did you know about the framing strategy? Were you aware of the custody leverage? She shook her head, but the damage had already attached itself to her name. Inside the courtroom, federal prosecutors moved swiftly. Charges were amended to include intentional fraud, obstruction risk, and conspiracy to manipulate legal systems for personal protection. Grant was placed under arrest before adjournment. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed louder than the audio had. He did not resist. He did not protest. Across the financial district, asset seizure proceedings initiated automatically. Executive accounts frozen. Luxury properties flagged for review. Holloway Holdings' valuation dropped beyond recovery. The custody petition was dismissed entirely within 24 hours. The judge cited retaliatory intent and documented framing evidence. Madeline's parental standing was restored without qualification. Clara leaned slightly toward her. "It's done." Madeline exhaled slowly. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell received confirmation that his cooperation had been formally acknowledged. He was no longer a silent witness. He was protected. In federal holding, Grant sat alone for the first time without advisors, analysts, or curated narrative. The recording replayed in his mind, not as strategy, but as exposure. He had believed he was safeguarding legacy, preserving empire, protecting growth. Instead, he had documented his own arrogance. Later that evening, Madeline returned home and sat quietly by the window. The skyline looked the same, indifferent to power shifts. The baby moved gently beneath her palm, grounding her. She did not feel triumphant. She felt clarity. Her phone rang. Clara's name illuminated the screen. "He's requested something," Clara said carefully. Madeline listened without interrupting. "From federal custody," Clara continued, "Grant has formally requested a private meeting with you before arraignment." Silence lingered. Madeline looked out at the city lights, remembering the speed of the divorce, the calculated silence, the custody petition filed under the language of protection. Now he wanted to speak. The empire had fallen. But something unfinished still remained. 3 months later, the city had moved on. Headlines had shifted. Markets stabilized around new leadership. Holloway Holdings was dismantled in structured liquidation, its name now cited in business schools as a case study in executive overreach. But for the people who had stood at the center of the collapse, the consequences had not faded. Madeline Pierce gave birth on a quiet Thursday morning just before sunrise. The delivery was steady, and when the nurse placed her daughter into her arms, the chaos of the past months felt distant and small. Eleanor Pierce cried once, then settled against her mother's chest as if instinctively aware she had arrived into a different kind of future. Madeline did not speak to reporters after the birth. She issued no statements. The silence was intentional. Public perception had already completed its reversal. The woman once described as unstable was now referenced as a whistleblower who halted corporate fraud before it reached irreversible scale. Within weeks, Madeline quietly launched the Pierce Foundation for Ethical Finance, partnering with former regulators and compliance experts to advocate for transparency reforms in executive liability structures. She did not present herself as a victim. She positioned herself as informed. Vanessa Cole experienced the opposite trajectory. Invitations that once felt automatic disappeared entirely. Luxury brand collaborations dissolved without announcement. The circles that once embraced her began treating her as reputational risk. Association with Grant Holloway no longer signaled status, it signaled scandal. The day of Grant's sentencing hearing drew national coverage again. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, capturing every expression, every reaction. Vanessa stood near the back entrance, sunglasses shielding a face that had grown thinner and less certain. Inside a secured visitation room prior to sentencing, Madeline agreed to meet Grant one final time. He looked older. Not physically aged, but stripped of posture. The controlled certainty that once defined him had eroded. "I won't take much of your time," he said quietly. Madeline remained standing, Eleanor asleep in her arms. "I miscalculated," Grant continued. "I thought control was protection. I thought eliminating risk meant eliminating you." "You eliminated yourself," she replied calmly. He exhaled slowly. "I lost the company. The board. Investors. But that isn't what keeps me awake." She said nothing. I lost my family, he admitted. The words were not theatrical. They were simple. And late. You didn't lose it, she said softly. You traded it. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. I convinced myself it was temporary. That once the IPO stabilized, everything would settle. You recorded a plan to frame me, she reminded him. Shame flickered across his face, unfiltered for the first time. I was afraid of exposure. You were afraid of accountability, she corrected. Outside, cameras captured Vanessa pacing as reporters closed in. Do you regret standing by him? One asked. She hesitated too long before answering. Yes, she said finally, her voice breaking slightly. I didn't understand who he was becoming. The confession did not restore her standing. It only confirmed distance. Back inside, Grant's voice lowered. I don't expect forgiveness. You shouldn't, Madeline replied. She reached into her coat pocket and removed her wedding ring, the one she had carried through the divorce, through the investigation, through the collapse. Without ceremony, she placed it on the metal visitation table. This is not anger, she said quietly. It's closure. Grant stared at the ring but did not touch it. Madeline adjusted Eleanor gently against her shoulder. My daughter will inherit integrity, she said. Not manipulation. When she walked out of the visitation room, she did not look back. In the courtroom, the sentence was delivered formally. Federal custody confirmed. Asset liquidation extended. The fall of Grant Holloway was complete, not because of media humiliation, but because the evidence had spoken. Outside the courthouse, Vanessa stood still as the announcement echoed through the press crowd. The man she had once believed untouchable was now reduced to case number and sentencing guidelines. The empire she attached herself to had dissolved. She blinked back tears as microphones moved closer. Madeline exited through a separate corridor, Eleanor secured carefully in her arms. Clara Whitmore joined her at the vehicle. Before they could leave, a federal prosecutor approached with a professional nod. There's another investigation developing, he said. A separate corporation with similar structural irregularities. Your insight could be valuable. Madeline listened quietly. The fall of Grant Holloway had ended one chapter. But influence, once earned through truth, does not disappear. As she closed the car door gently and looked down at her daughter, Madeline understood something clearly. The empire had collapsed. Her purpose had just begun. Stories like this aren't just about wealth or scandal, they're about consequences. If you believe accountability still matters, stay connected to this channel. Because not every truth gets the spotlight it deserves. And if this story made you think even once, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Now let me ask you something honestly. If you discovered the person you once trusted had built their success on deception, would you walk away quietly to protect yourself? Or would you risk everything to expose the truth? What would you have chosen?